Many manors, especially in England and Northern Europe, practiced the open field system of farming whereby 2 or 3 large fields were divided into strips, with each peasant family farming several strips scattered around the fields. These strips were distributed so that each family would get a fair share of the fertile and less productive land. Major activities, such as sowing, plowing, and harvesting, were carried out jointly by the entire community. Daily life. The privacy modern people enjoy was far from the norm in 1750. Poorer families would live and eat together in single-room cottages by day, and all sleep in one bed at night. In wealthier families, the owners of a house would share their house with servants and workers. Even in aristocratic households, the family itself might only have a few rooms to itself, with the main sections of the house shared with a host of retainers and servants. For the majority of people, including young children, days were long. Working all the hours of daylight was barely enough to get through the tasks necessary to ensure survival. They did not have the labor-saving devices that we have today. Almost everything had to be done by muscle power from either a human or an animal. Women were legally subject to men, and their main role in society was to be a wife and mother. In poorer families, women worked alongside their menfolk in the field and workshop, as well as carrying out household chores such as cooking, washing, cleaning, making clothes, grinding corn, and so on. Wealthy women had more opportunities, but they were still limited. In aristocratic circles, women wove, spun, and managed the domestic side of the household. In circumstances where the men were away or otherwise unable to manage affairs, the lady of the household took charge, including leading the defense of a castle against attack. Widows in particular could have a large measure of economic independence, and in many cases, could take over the ownership and management of their deceased husband's business. Children, education and literacy. Through this time, children took on adult roles at a young age. For most, education was a luxury. Children from poorer families were put to work on the family's plot of land or in the workshop at the age of 7 or so. If the family could afford to send them to school, this too began at 7. Sons of craftsmen and merchants were sent to another household to be apprenticed to another master for 7 years, learning how to follow in their trade. For some children with connections, they helped support their family by acting as servants in aristocratic households. Girls of all classes were trained in weaving, needlework, and household chores they would eventually need when they had their own homes to manage. The majority of the feudal population was illiterate. As education was not free, only those with the financial means could afford to send their children to school. Literacy and education did continue to expand throughout the 18th century, but the acquisition of education caused controversy and sometimes even bloodshed as educated people started to question political and religious authority. European power distribution. The Catholic Church. The 1600s and 1700s were a time of religious, intellectual, and political conflict across the globe. In Europe, the Protestant Reformation challenged the religious and political power of the Catholic Church. Martin Luther became the figurehead of the Reformation when he posted his 95 Theses to the doors of Wittenberg Church in 1517. Luther, a German monk and moral theology professor, questioned the selling of indulgences by the Catholic Church. He believed sola fide, or faith alone, determined a believer's future in heaven. The Church could not sell indulgences to forgive sins. He also questioned the lack of scriptural understanding by the clergy, and promoted the sola scriptura, a belief that Scripture alone is the supreme authority in all spiritual matters. These new ideas led to more people questioning the Church's interpretation of Scripture and the eventual lessening of the Catholic Church's authority.
Anti-disestablishment to Arianism.
Many Catholics throughout Europe viewed this challenge to church authority as heresy, or an act against God. As a result, the conflict between Catholicism and Protestantism, a name derived from this period of protest against the Catholic Church, became a major source of intolerance and war. Europe was gripped by social upheaval, resulting in multiple religious conflicts for the next 200 years. In Europe, the 30 Years' War devastated much of Central Europe and led to significant divisions between Catholic and Protestant political states. In Africa and Asia, Islam continued to spread southward and eastward through trade networks, population migrations, and missionary activities. Absolutism in Europe, France. A number of factors contributed to the rise of absolute monarchies in Europe in the 17th and 18th centuries. These monarchies were controlled by a single powerful leader who claimed their power through heredity and divine right. Divine right is the belief that because a monarch's power comes from God, a ruler's responsibility is first and foremost to God, and not necessarily to his or her subjects. Nevertheless, as religious power declined, subjects accepted the power of absolute rulers because it provided relative stability during uncertain times. During the 16th and 17th centuries, with the rise of the nation-state and the Protestant Reformation, Louis XIV of France, along with other monarchs in Russia and Spain, used the theory of divine right to justify the king's absolute authority in both political and spiritual matters. This theory was used in England under the reign of the Stuart monarchs, James I, 1603-1625, and Charles I, 1625-1649, but because the majority of people never believed in it, it was discredited in the aftermath of the English Civil War. Louis XIV, 1638-1715, model of absolutism. The era of absolutism, exemplified by the Sun King Louis XIV Bourbon of France, marks the rise of rulers throughout Europe who had absolute power over their nations. French Bishop Bossuet declared that it was the divine right of monarchs to rule, concluding that kings were God's anointed representatives on earth. Louis XIV rose to power in 1643 and acted upon this belief, governing France as if he were placed on earth by God to rule. He allegedly declared, "L'état moi," or I am the state. His power stemmed from the fact that during his reign, he maintained a powerful and unified France. Louis built the enormously extravagant palace at Versailles as a means to centralize his power. Through the use of the palace in court rituals and elaborate entertainments, he successfully kept the nobles occupied, even requiring some of them to live at Versailles, and distracted them from their desire to have power within the government. Louis was highly successful in his domestic ambitions to achieve absolute power through the centralized bureaucracy. He successfully controlled rebellious nobles and made himself the center of French power and culture. People depended upon him for advancement and thrived upon his goodwill. Despite some domestic success, France's continuous involvement in war, poor economic policies, and restrictions on religious freedom for Protestants eventually led to the impoverishment of France. English Civil War, 1642-1651. Absolutism was the dominant force in European politics for hundreds of years, with the exception of England. Since the Magna Carta of 1215, the power of England's monarch had been limited by the creation of a parliament. This new body of government was meant to check and balance the absolute monarchy of the king. This kind of government is known as a constitutional monarchy, a first in European history. However, in the mid-1600s, English kings would challenge this belief. In 1642, Charles I hoped to unite the kingdoms of England, Scotland, and Ireland into a new single kingdom, fulfilling the dream of his father, James I. Many English parliamentarians had suspicions regarding such a move because they feared that setting up a new kingdom might destroy the old English traditions which once bound the English monarchy. Finally, many members of Parliament, a significant portion of whom were members of Reformed Protestant churches, distrusted Charles' motives, mainly due to his religious policies and marriage to a Roman Catholic. From 1642, Charles fought the armies of the English and Scottish parliaments in the English Civil War. After his defeat in 1645, he surrendered to a Scottish force that eventually gave him over to the English Parliament. Charles refused to accept his captors' demands for a constitutional monarchy. Charles was tried, convicted, and executed for high treason in January 1649. The monarchy was abolished and the republic called the Commonwealth of England was declared. In 1660, after 11 years, the monarchy was restored to Charles's son, Charles I.